I now call the Minister for Defence Materiel.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's 15 minutes we'll never get back. 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes I waited for something positive. 15 minutes I waited for one positive idea. Didn't hear it. All we got was negativity. All we got was bile. All we got was bile and invective. As the Prime Minister said in question time today, just a mouthful of insults and no ideas. 15 minutes, the people watching in the gallery must think, gee, I wish I could have that 15 minutes back. That was that bad, they wish they were watching the Senate for the last 15 minutes. People listening to the broadcast must have been thinking, I want that 15 minutes back. Thinking I could have washed my hair. I could have walked the dog. Because all they got was bile and bluster. No ideas, no policy, no vision, just toxic negativity. Just Dr. No. The man who says no to everything. The man who says no to almost everything.
Honourable members should not interject from outside their seats. The man who couldn't
find the positive side to a battery. No wonder, because every time he opens his mouth, he gets it wrong. This is an MPI, Mr Deputy Speaker, about competency. Competency from a man who couldn't even competently pull off a political stunt this week. Talk about competency. This is the man who appointed Barnaby Joyce in charge of finance. That's like putting Homer Simpson in charge of the nuclear power plant. Remember, this is the opposition leader who told people, I remember it on his website, said, donate to the Liberal Party, not to the people of Queensland for the flood recovery. This is the leader of the opposition. This is the leader of the opposition who rips his policies off the One Nation website. This is the leader of the opposition who ripped $1 billion out of the health system. This is the leader of the opposition who said, quote, Australia's circumstances weren't dire during the global financial crisis. It's the same man who slept through the divisions to decide whether we were going to stimulate the economy to stop Australia going into recession. Wasn't just one division either, there were 5 divisions, so it must have been a deep sleep. And this is the leader of the opposition who opposes the NBN because he says, and I'm quoting here from the Sydney Morning Herald, Tuesday, December 21st, 2010, says that the NBN is essentially a video entertainment system. On all the big calls, it's this leader of the opposition who's got it wrong, and he's got the gall, Mr Deputy Speaker, to come in here with an MPI about competency. Being Prime Minister of Australia requires more than just the ability to say no. Australia has been made great by people who had the courage to say yes, not those who have the incompetency to do anything other than to say no. And when you look at the history of Australia, whether it's over the last 12 months or over the last 100 years, it's the Australian Labor Party that has made the big reforms that made this country what it is. Whether it's the establishment of the old age pension or workers' compensation, whether it's building the foundations of the ANZUS Alliance or APEC, whether it's Medicare or native title, whether it's the Racial Discrimination Act or the Sex Discrimination Act, or whether it's the big economic reforms responsible for 2 decades of uninterrupted economic growth, like floating the dollar, competition policy, tariff reform or compulsory superannuation, it's the Labor Party that's done it, and more often than not, opposed by the Liberal Party. And it's still the case. It is still the case, Mr Deputy Speaker, today. And on the last 12 months, let me tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's this Prime Minister which has structurally separated Telstra, something the Liberal Party never had the courage to do. It's this Prime Minister that's negotiated the historic health agreement with the states, something the Liberal Party were incapable of doing. It's this Prime Minister who is helping the people of Queensland to rebuild after the floods, something the Liberal Party is trying to stop us from doing. It's this Prime Minister that's got the big mining companies to agree to pay more tax. It's this Prime Minister that's putting the budget on track for surplus in 2012-13. And it's this Prime Minister that is putting a price on carbon. And on every single one of these, it's the Leader of the Opposition who just says no. He talks in his MPI about competence. Well, the most important job of the federal government, the most important job of the Australian government is to keep the economy strong, to keep Australians working. Let's have a look at the Australian government's record. Unemployment today in Australia is 4.9%. Compare that to the United States, where unemployment there is 9.1%. In the last 3 years, we have created 700,000 jobs. Over the same period in the United States, they have lost 6.6 million jobs. Now, if the most important job of the Australian government is to keep the economy strong, to keep Australians working, then by any measure this government has been extremely successful. Now, compare that to the opposition who opposed the stimulus, who, if we had followed their advice, would have plunged the Australian economy into recession and would have forced 200,000 Australians onto the dole queue. But this is not the only thing that they have opposed. We're increasing the superannuation of Australian workers, and they oppose it. We're building the national broadband network. They want to rip it up. We've increased hospital funding by 50%. When they were in government, they ripped $1 billion out of the hospital system. We are rolling out the biggest funding increase for mental health ever, and they would fund increases in mental health by cutting other health services. We've introduced the biggest pension increase in 100 years, an extra $128 a fortnight for singles and an extra $116 for couples. In 11 years, Mr Deputy Speaker, they did nothing to deliver a permanent increase in the pension. We've introduced Australia's first national paid parental leave scheme. Started in January. First 5 months, 65,000 families have benefited. And the Liberal Party is now talking about scrapping their own paid parental leave scheme to pay for their own climate change plan. In education, let's take education. We have doubled the funding for schools. We've built, you might be interested in this one, we've built 3,000 libraries in schools, where the Liberal Party built 3,000 flagpoles. We're building trade training centres for every high school to train students to become apprentices, where the Liberal Party have promised to scrap them. But the difference between the government and the Liberal Party is no clearer than when it comes to climate change. The government's determined to take on this big reform, and the Liberal Party, like most big reforms that have come before, have got no ideas, just an increasingly desperate, increasingly unbelievable scare campaign. Have a look, Mr Deputy Speaker, at the scare campaign that we've seen over the last few months. In April, the Leader of the Opposition went to Whyalla and he said that a carbon tax would wipe Whyalla off the map. It got better. In May, he went to Geelong. He said that the carbon tax would be the final nail in the motor industry's coffin in Australia, and said that it would spell the end for Australia as a first world economy. Well, in the same month he went to Weet-Bix and said it would kill breakfast. 3 weeks ago, he said it would kill the manufacturing industry in this country. 2 weeks ago, he said it'd be the death of the coal industry. Last week, he said the steel industry would disappear. All of it, of course, just nonsense. But let's have a look at some of the claims, some of the scare campaign, and have a look at some of the facts. First, let's have a look at this claim that it would cause the death of the coal industry. Well, Treasury have modelled the impact of the CPRS on the coal industry. They found the coal industry output would continue to grow by 66% over the next 40 years. So much for the death of the coal industry. Interestingly, the planned investment by the resource sector over the course of the next few years sheds a few more interesting facts on this matter. It shows that the industry doesn't believe this nonsense either, because there's now $430 billion in resource investment either underway or on the drawing boards as of April, up from around $380 billion in October last year. And interestingly, $70 billion of that work is in coal-related projects. Let's have a look at one of the other ridiculous claims. 2 weeks ago, in another MPI with the Leader of the Opposition, he came in here and he predicted hundreds of thousands of jobs around the country would be lost and the end of Australia as a first world economy. Well, it's interesting again because Treasury have done some modelling. Well, he did say it, believe it or not. Hansard records it. And that shows that a carbon tax at $20 a tonne would not have any impact on the number of jobs created. In the next 9 years, according to the modelling, it says there would be 1.6 million more jobs created in Australia, with or without the tax. With or without the tax. But this is how ridiculous it gets, because it wasn't just the coal industry, or wasn't just the steel industry, it wasn't just jobs he was talking about. Because 2 weeks ago,
should now be rested.
2 weeks ago, he went to Visy in Brisbane, where he said that the carbon tax would cause the cost of beer cartons to go up. This is a serious matter. Unfortunately, on this matter, he's right. It would cause the price of beer cartons to go up. Well, I'll give you the information, by 0.0003 or 3/100ths of a cent.
It's a scandal.
It is a scandal. It is a scandal. I've done the calculations because I like my beer. Based on the former CPRS, you'd have to buy 3,000 beer cartons before it would cost you an extra $1. Serious scare campaign. Serious scare campaign. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the people of Australia deserve better than that. I think they deserve better than 15 minutes of bile. Well, they got 25 minutes of bile from the Leader of the Opposition today, and they deserve better than the 18 months of incompetence that we've seen from this Leader of the Opposition. They deserve better. They certainly deserve better than another dodgy Liberal scare campaign. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we know when it comes to the Liberal Party, we know they've got form when it comes to dodgy scare campaigns. In the 1950s, it was Reds under the bed. In the 1970s, it was China. The Liberal Party said that Whitlam's engagement with China was, quote, a demonic game of mahjong. In the 1980s, the great scare campaign was Medicare. This is what they said about Medicare at the time. Quote, a total and complete failure. Quote, a financial monster. Quote, a human nightmare. This is what they said about Medicare in the 1980s, the Liberal Party. In the 1990s, it was native title. They said you'd lose your backyard. In the 1990s, it was compulsory superannuation as well. They said the introduction of compulsory superannuation would destroy the economy, cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs. On all of these counts, whether it's Reds under the bed, China, Medicare, native title, whether it's compulsory superannuation, all wrong and all not so scary anymore. Medicare is now the cornerstone of our health system. Native title, well, didn't take anyone's backyard. Superannuation didn't destroy jobs, it actually created them. Instead of the 100,000 jobs that the Liberal Party feared would be lost, it created 60,000 jobs. It was one of the most important economic reforms of the 20th century. And the same arguments are being made by the Liberal Party now that were made then, that it would destroy the economy, that it would kill jobs. Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, they were wrong then and they are wrong now. On all of the big calls, the Liberal Party and this Leader of the Opposition have got it wrong, and they've got the gall, the absolute gall, to come into this House and raised a debate about competency.